Austria Russia relations, the G20, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. The lands now part of Austria were once simply a collection of fiefs of the House of Habsburg whose head was also the Holy Roman Emperor from the 15th century on. The history of Austria in international relations during this time period was synonymous with the foreign policy of the Habsburgs. Russia was more or less uninterested in European affairs before Peter I, but there were contacts between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Tsars of Muscovy. The most known of all was the embassy conducted by Herberstein in the 16th century. Between these two vast monarchies lay the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire. However, as the Habsburgs expanded their domain south and east and Russia south and west, relations between the two monarchies became vital to European security. When Peter the Great was proclaimed emperor in 1721, his and his successors' recognition of the imperial title was delayed by the Habsburgs, the other claimant successors of the Roman Empire, until 1742. During the War of Austrian Succession, Russia's entry into European affairs created a recurring alliance between Russia and Austria, often directed against the Ottomans and France. Russia and Austria were allies during the War of the Polish Succession, and from 1787 to 1791 the monarchies both waged separate wars against the Ottomans. Both countries participated in the first and third partition of Poland. The two countries do not border each other until the second partition of Poland. The coming of the French Revolution created ideological solidarity between the absolutist monarchies including Russia and Austria, which both fought against France during the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. In 1804 Austria was proclaimed an empire, and after the Congress of Vienna the great reactionary powers of Europe pledged to work together to keep revolution at bay. And Austria and Russia were the greatest defenders of the Vienna settlement. After 1815 Austria's policy as said by Clemens von Metternich was based on a realistic acceptance of Russia's political predominance in Moldavia and Wallachia. He obtained from Tsar Nicholas I some economic concessions during the 1830s. The two powers began to cooperate, with the mutual aim of preserving the status quo. The revolutions of 1848 shook the Habsburg lands, and the Hungarian lands declared their independence. Russia intervened by invading Hungary to suppress the revolutions and restore the Habsburg sovereignty. During the Crimean War Austria maintained a policy of hostile neutrality towards Russia, and, while not going to war, was supportive of the Anglo-French coalition. This stance deeply angered Nicholas I of Russia and was a serious strain to Russo-Austrian relations thereafter, although it was Russia that was punished by the Treaty of Paris. In the long run it was Austria that lost the most from the Crimean War despite having barely taken part in it. Having abandoned its alliance with Russia, Austria was diplomatically isolated following the war. Russia subsequently stood aside as Austria was evicted from the Italian and German states. That Russian neutrality towards its former ally clearly contributed to Austrian defeat in the 1866 Austro-Prussian War and its loss of influence in most German-speaking lands. The Habsburgs therefore gave in to Hungarian demands for autonomy and refounded their state as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. France, after the Franco-Prussian War and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, was fervently hostile to Germany, and made an alliance with Russia. The Great Slovak Empire competed with the newly renamed Austro-Hungarian Empire for an increased role in the Balkans at the expense of the Ottoman Empire, and the foundations were in place for creating the diplomatic alliances that would lead to World War I. Austrian officials worried that Russia was adopting a pan-Slavist policy designed to unite all Slavonic-speaking peoples under the Tsar's leadership. This led them to pursue an anti-Slavic policy domestically and abroad. The major source of tension between Austria-Hungary and Russia was the so-called Eastern Question. What to do about the weakening Ottoman Empire and its rebellious Christian subjects? From 1873 to 1887, at least nominally, Austria-Hungary and Russia were again allies with the German Empire in the League of Three Emperors. The 1878 Treaty of Berlin concluded in the aftermath of Russia's victory against the Ottoman Empire in the War of 1877, allowed Austria-Hungary to occupy the Bosnia Vilayet. This, in turn, brought Austria into conflict with the Principality of Serbia, an autonomous state within the Ottoman Empire under Russian influence and protection. The visit to St. Petersburg of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph and his conference with Nicholas II of Russia in 1897 heralded a secret agreement between the two empires to